Video games are a fascinating medium, to say the least. They allow you to have experiences like no other. Sneaking through a robot-infested factory with nothing but a gun in your hand, stepping out into a huge open field for the very first time. Games create great, memorable experiences for their respective player bases, but that all wouldn't be possible without one thing: context. Stories are like the backbone of any video game. Without it, sneaking through a robot factory would be just that. There would be no stakes, no reason, no motivation for doing anything that you'd be doing, which is why it's important that developers do stories right. Hey everyone, I'm Rhythm, and this is Game Gear, a series on the intricacies of video game design. Today, we'll be taking a good look at some of the best narratives video games have ever told and analyze what made them so great. Admittedly, this is a pretty big topic, so though I won't be able to cover every nook and cranny of it in this episode, I'll do my very best to explain some of the most common techniques developers use to forge compelling narratives and create memorable experiences in their games. Let's begin. One of the greatest ways that developers can use the gaming medium to their advantage is by having players directly fondle with the outcome of the story, and have them make key impactful decisions which have approximate impact on the story, giving each player who bought the game a unique experience, as well as placing much more emotional weight onto the narrative. For example, in 2017's Detroit Become Human, you make many spontaneous decisions under limited time constraints which could potentially impact the relationship, mood, or even the life and death state of your characters. These decisions are seriously nerve-wracking, and sometimes you might even end up making a decision that you end up regretting, due to just the sheer anxiety of the situation. But this, along with the already progressing narrative, can also be used to help express some of the game's key themes and ideas. Let me explain. There is a scene in Chapter 15, The Nest, which illustrates my point quite well. In this chapter, you control police android Connor, and along with Lieutenant Hank Anderson, you spend the majority of this chapter investigating an old, supposedly abandoned apartment flat, only to find out that there's been a deviant android hiding inside it all along. Connor and the lieutenant give chase, but there comes a point during the chase where Hank gets shoved off the ledge by the deviant, and is then left dangling there with just one arm. Now, with Connor's brilliant android mind, he calculates that Hank's odds of survival are 89%. Relatively high, right? We are given the choice to either A, save Hank and bring his survival odds up to 100%, or B, continue chasing the deviant, which would give us ample chance of being able to capture and confront him, therefore leading to success in our mission. Most players here would see that Hank was likely going to survive this encounter, and in the 10 seconds that they are given to decide, most choose to continue chasing the deviant, up until his inevitable suicide. Yeah, he jumps off the building. Bad decision, huh? Actually, there is no way to actually catch the deviant alive in this scene. Either you catch up to him, and he kills himself after being cornered, or he manages to get away because you spent time trying to save Hank. In fact, saving Hank is actually the only good ending to this chapter, as if you don't, you get a huge drop in affinity with him. This was this little rant.
You bastard! You saw I was gonna fall and you'd rather let me die than fail your fucking mission!
I had to make a choice. It seemed to me...
What am I to you? A statistic? A 0, a 1 in your fucking program? Huh? Is that how you see humans, you bastard? Jesus.
I understand you're upset. Perhaps I didn't assess the
Fuck
situation.
you and your fucking assessment! Come here.
Given the context of the story, this scene really hits hard and makes you rethink how you've been assessing the situations all along. Were you really thinking like an android? Did you really put the success of your mission in front of saving your own friend? So, by putting you in charge of the situation and how it goes, Detroit Become Human really manages to personalize your experience and deepen your connection with the story. It really makes you think about some of its key themes of humanity and technology, and by putting your key decision in the middle of all this, it really adds to the immersiveness and emotional weight of the game. So, to conclude this segment, through use of decisions and placing control of the situation in the player's hands, developers can easily add more emotional stake to their narratives and more naturally express their main themes and ideas to their target audiences. At some point during your academic life, you've probably heard a teacher tell you the phrase, "Show, don't tell." Well, what if I told you that this phrase not only applies in writing, but also in movies, video games, and other interactive media? Telling players stories and information from the surroundings is one of the oldest techniques in the book when it comes to game design, but boy is it effective. When done right, it can open up a whole new world for the player, greatly adding to the immersiveness and captivation of the video game. This is why developers often fill their environments with tiny details, which can communicate anything from the status quo to even the main mechanics of the game world. A great example of a game that does this well is BioShock, a horror-themed first-person shooter which takes place in the underwater dystopia of Rapture. BioShock is a fantastic game overall, but where it really nails environmental storytelling is definitely in its first area, the Kashmir restaurant. This area is a real mess, and I mean that in a good way. One step in and you can already see the broken railings, flashing neon signs, cracked floorboards. Plus, there's just this weird, creepy waltz music that's playing all the time. Already you can tell what type of place this is, and probably have a pretty good idea of what might have happened to it given the context of the game. But how? Environmental storytelling requires players to put the pieces of the story together for themselves, and this is no exception. But the setting and the ambiance of this restaurant give us more than enough hints so that we can form a pretty good idea of what may have happened just by stepping through the front door. The Happy New Year 1959 sign on the left side of the room tells us that this place was ravaged sometime around New Year's Eve of 1959, as it surely would have been taken down the day after. Also, the cracked floorboards and destroyed railing show us the method in which the monsters may have entered the restaurant and main event hall through. Furniture and wallpaper give us a decent idea of what this area may have looked like before, and the still lit "Dancing Downstairs" sign suggests that there was a dance going on that night. All this also gives us an idea of what sort of helpful supplies we might find here. Furthermore, from the waltz music playing in the background, we can imagine what sort of people would be at a party like this, and what sort of party it was. Also, from the crashing and splashing sounds we hear from downstairs, we can also assume that the monsters are still here. I got all this information about the lore and history of this place, as well as an idea of what happened to it, without a single text box popping up and telling me. All this can be inferred from the environment, sounds, ambiance, and lighting of the place, and little to no text was necessary in telling me all that. This triumphs over the measly text boxes and casual dialogue game designers used to use, and is much more effective in manifesting the kind of location and situation that the player is in, which adds to the immersiveness of the game tenfold. Now that is effective environmental storytelling. The oddball in this group of game design techniques is a relatively new one, which can most commonly be found in the genre of roguelikes, a subgenre of role-playing games primarily characterized by procedurally generated levels, resource management, and permadeath. Procedural storytelling is a form of storytelling that can dynamically differ between playthroughs, and is based on a multiple playthroughs, multiple stories tone. Of course, these stories can only differ to such an extent, but if done right, you could get something like Moon Hunters, a prime example of how random procedural generation doesn't have to mean a lackluster story. In Moon Hunters, up to 4 players are tasked with finding out what happened to the moon, which doesn't rise one night in this area. The game follows a roguelike RPG style, and has gameplay based on exploring randomly generated areas and speaking with randomly spawned NPCs. However, what makes its narrative so interesting is that the game's ending will vary greatly depending on the various choices the players make over the course of the game, and the outcome of the final battle. But given the amount of randomness there is in a game like this, how did lead designer Tanya Short and her team create such a consistently well-written narrative? Well, the answer to that lies within the characters they created and their respective personalities. As Short once said in a Gamasutric blog post, roguelikes are about many truths, about a pluralistic view of the world. There's not a single truth of what the game is and what the intended experience is. That is why they made the choice to break away from moral duality systems, instead replacing them with more interesting options, such as to sing when encountering a praying man, or to just shrug off another's request.
The game also gives players numerous viable ways to solve story problems, such as to find a priestess to help bring back the moon, or to simply ask other tribes. This helps branch off the story into different directions and create interesting scenarios, all of which will differ drastically between playthroughs.
Tanya also made sure to focus on creating lots of characters with little personalities and unique interactions over having hundreds of widely different scenarios lacking depth. She made a point advocating smaller quest lines and a larger cast of characters as it would make repeat playthroughs more interesting, allowing players to explore how each branch plays out. Short's approach to procedural storytelling, though not perfect, is applauded as one of the best attempts of the genre so far. It allowed for vastly different story experiences per playthrough, and allowed for players to have their own unique interactions with different NPCs each time, allowing them to make key story decisions differently each time, and overall just letting them run wild with their own chosen character, generating their own narrative of who they wanted their character to be and how they would do things. Being a technique currently limited to the gaming medium, I'd say it's a pretty nice experience. Opening the game and knowing that no one else would have experienced the exact same thing that you're about to experience, that your story is not set in stone. Although video games do arguably hold some of the best stories mankind has ever told, there are some limitations that prevent the narrative and gaming genres from overlapping perfectly. Firstly, making a game interactive means that the narrative loses some of its focus, as most games give players enough agency to move around and do extra side stuff along the way, which sometimes ruins the urgency of some story moments. Also, most games are expected to take a certain amount of time to complete, so some developers tend to stretch parts out, using fetch quests, time-wasting ordeals where the player just grinds out certain items, or padding, where more gameplay and story moments are added than necessary to increase playtime. These do nothing but drag out the story and gameplay, and almost always bring down the whole overall experience. Additionally, the repeated need for a gameplay loop, as video game analyst Mark Brown once specified in an interview with myself, can certainly weaken the potential for great stories in games. As video games are centralized around, well, gameplay, this definitely limits the sorts of stories that can be told, as there often has to be some sort of shooting, fighting, or combat going on for the core loop of gameplay to work. If a video game goes too far down the narrative end, all it becomes is a movie with some gameplay tacked onto it, and that makes it a completely different medium altogether. But though these factors certainly limit the gaming genre from really being the perfect medium for stories, as it still is, video games can still create incredible stories with huge emotional impact. So, there you have it. 3 ways games forge compelling narratives, and some ways in which the genre may be limited in that respect. Video games have opened up a massive realm for storytelling, and allowed us to express ourselves in ways never thought possible in years past. With so many new inventions such as VR and touchpads making video games so much more immersive and realistic, I cannot wait to see how these genres continue to evolve in years to come.